Hello, my name is Jason Demora, and welcome back to By Faith Bible Studies. For the last 3 weeks, I have taken a step back from Ecclesiastes because of some school events that were going on and some other things that I had to focus on. And I say the last 3 weeks because a friend of mine was supposed to do this passage, but sadly they were not able to. But on the other hand, it is kind of a happy thing because I'm able to jump back into Ecclesiastes a little earlier than I thought. A quick thank you to Brad and Timmy for giving messages the last 2 weeks. I really appreciate hearing those messages. Brad's was just such a powerful message from such a young soul who was preaching the word and showing that, hey, even at a young age, you can teach the word just like I am, but even younger than that is awesome. And I know God's going to do so much wonderful things in his life. And Timmy, it's always good to have him back, and I'm so happy that he was on here. Really thankful for both of them and really thankful to be back as well. I will say that honesty is the best policy, and because my friend fell short rather recently, I had only had about 24 hours to prepare for this message, but I hope that I did the best that I could, and it will be more of a summary of this passage, and we won't be able to go as deep. And so I highly encourage you to take some time and really go into this passage yourself, as you should with anything that I speak on here, anything that anyone else speaks about the Bible, to hear it and then take a deeper look on your own. I highly encourage that. Before we jump into our passage today, which is going to be Ecclesiastes 6, verse 10 through chapter 7, verse 14, we need a little bit of context of where we are in Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapters 1 through chapter 2 was a sort of dual introduction. Chapter 1 verses 1 through 11 was more of a cosmic introduction to the entire book of Ecclesiastes from a view that was kind of outside of time. And then verses 12 through the end of chapter 2, we had a more personal introduction from Solomon. And each of these introductions focused on really the phrase that's given in verse 2. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And we talked about what vanity is and how it means this idea of the shortness of life, and how life is not meaningless, but it is short, and so it almost seems as if it is meaningless. Then he shares in the speech, in the introduction that focuses on his life, how everything that he attempted was also vain. It says here that I realize that this also is striving after wind when he speaks about wisdom, and that it says here, thus I considered all my activities which my hands had done, and the labor which I exerted, and behold, all was vanity and striving after wind, and there was no profit in any of it. And he goes on in verse 17 to say, so I hated life, for the work which had been done in the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after wind. Then he speaks about labor and says that this too is vanity and a great evil. For what does a man gain in his labor and in his striving with which he labors under the sun? Behold, all his days his task is painful and grievous. Even at his night his mind does not rest. This too is vanity. And thus we had an introduction to Ecclesiastes in this idea that life is vain. Then from chapter 3 to chapter 6, verse 9, which Timmy talked about last week, we had a look at the existential crisis, at this idea that if life is meaningless, how are we to live? How are we to live in this world? And in this talk, we really focused on this idea of enjoying life because it is a gift from God. And through that, we looked at time and God's sovereignty in chapter 3. In chapter 4, we looked at friendship and a fallen world. And in chapter 5, verses 10 through chapter 6, verse 9, we looked at money and how we are supposed to use wealth and how wealth cannot be a god and should not be a god. And really, I think wealth is an interesting topic because wealth is really a way to have control. And what Timmy was talking about last week is this idea that God is in control and wealth does not fix that problem. Interestingly, in this talk that I'm talking about right now, I skipped verses 1 through 9. And I did that on purpose because verses 1 through 9, which Brad talked about, is really a prelude of things to come. It was a little bit out of place in a sense. What I mean by that is that chapters 3 through chapter 6, verse 9, is really an investigation into the many places of life. This idea that Solomon looked at all of these things and took notes and looked at them and saw how hard life was and how to live in light of that and how to make friends in a fallen world, how to look at time rightly and how to look at wealth rightly. But then out of place we have this call to fear God. And this prelude is a prelude of things to come. That Solomon is going to return to this theme, but he put it there so that we could have a prelude of his main message. And his main message is to fear God and obey him, and that is the chief end of man. And this end of main message we are going to see in chapter 12, but we're not there yet. What we are entering right now is chapter 6 verse 10 through chapter 12 verse 8, which I would call part 2 of Ecclesiastes. What we're going to read today is sort of a shift from a foundation of the themes of Ecclesiastes to a further analysis of what our response is to those themes. This is what I mean by that. In chapter 3 through chapter 6 verse 9, we looked at these three main themes. And I want you to have these three main themes in your mind, and I hope that you learned these three main themes in the past month or so that we looked at these chapters. It is God's sovereignty. We mostly saw this in chapter 3, and this idea that he is in charge of all time. We looked at the fallen nature of man and how all will die. This was mostly evident at the end of chapter 3 going into chapter 4. And we also looked at the vanity of life, which I have already spoken about in this introduction. Those main three themes were addressed, mentioned, but no real answer was given. And I feel that in chapters 6 verse 10 through chapter 12 verse 8, we're going to have answers to this question. Because the question is really how to live in light of death. This question has been brought up many times. How do we live in light of death? Death is something that we need to focus on. We need to focus on God's sovereignty over all things. We need to focus on the fallen nature of man that leads to death, and that because of death, life seems vain. We need to focus on these things, but how do we actually live in light of death? And so we are moving into part 2, really addressing that question of how to live in light of death. And we'll be looking at specific ways to do that. Today we're going to be looking at the idea of wisdom, but we'll be also talking about how to obey rulers, how to focus on your future, how to enjoy life correctly, and also how to live life as a young person and live life as an older person, and how to actually live life in light of death. Some practical applications of these three main themes that we've really gained from Solomon's investigations. So now that we have this context of where we are, I'm going to read the passage, and as we read it, I want you to read it and see what I mean by that. Chapter 6, 10 through 12 is a sort of introductory conclusion. And what I mean by that is it is concluding everything that is before it, and it is introducing what is to come after. It is the introduction to part 2 as well as the conclusion to part 1. And then chapter 7 is our first main theme, and I would say the most important one, and it is this talk on wisdom. Let me read the passage. Chapter 6, verse 10 through chapter 7, verse 14. Whatever exists has already been named, and it is known what man is, for he cannot dispute with him who is stronger than he is. For there are many words which increase futility. What then is the advantage to a man? For who knows what is good for a man to do during his lifetime, during the few years of his futile life? He will spend them like a shadow. For who can tell a man what will be after him under the sun? A good name is better than a good ointment, and the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting, because that is the end of every man, and the living take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for when a face is sad, a heart may be happy. The mind of the wise is in the house of mourning, while the mind of fools is in the house of pleasure. It is better to listen to the rebuke of a wise man than for one to listen to the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorn bushes under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool, and this too is futility. For oppression makes a wise man mad, and a bribe corrupts the heart. The end of a matter is better than its beginning. Patience of spirit is better than haughtiness of spirit. Do not be eager in your heart to be angry, for anger resides in the bosom of fools. Do not say, why is it that the former days were better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask about this. Wisdom, along with inheritance, is good, and an advantage to those who see the sun. For wisdom is protection, just as money is protection. But the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the lives of its possessors. Consider the work of God, for who is able to straighten what he has bent? In the day of prosperity be happy, but in the day of adversity consider. God has made the one as well as the other, so that man will not discover anything that will be after him. This is the word of the living God, the introduction to part 2 of Ecclesiastes. Let me pray. Dear Lord, I pray that as we look at this exposition of wisdom and how to live in light of death, Lord, that you would give me wisdom to give this message, and that those who would listening would grow in wisdom as well, and that all of us would want to know you more and to fear you more, for fearing you is the beginning of wisdom, and so that we may grow in wisdom and we may grow in understanding of how to live in light of death. Amen. As mentioned before, I would say that chapter 6, verses 10 through 12, is an introductory conclusion, or as you would maybe want to call it, a conclusionary introduction. As we look at these passages, I want to connect back to those themes that I talked about earlier. Let me explain. In verse 10, it says, whatever exists has already been named, and it is known what man is, for he cannot dispute with him who is stronger than he is. Notice how this verse speaks about that first theme, God's sovereignty. God is in control. He is the one who is stronger. He is the one who you cannot dispute with. But notice in this verse how God is expressed. He cannot dispute with him who is stronger than he is. The name of God is not given. What's interesting here is that whatever exists has already been named and it is known what man is. Notice that he's talking really about Genesis here, and that in creation, man was named. Adam is named Adam, and Eve is named Eve. And Adam was given the responsibility to name all of the animals, and so they were all named. They were understood. They make sense to the human mind. Adam makes sense to Eve, and Eve makes sense to Adam. But him who is stronger does not have a name. Now, we have the name Yahweh, but where does Yahweh come from? This is the covenant name that is given to Israel, interestingly never used in Ecclesiastes. Rather, the more common word for God is used. But why is neither of these words mentioned here? Because Solomon is making a point about God and about the name Yahweh itself. Let's turn real quick to Exodus 3:13 through 14. This is where we hear the name of Yahweh first, and where God is first given this name. But is it really a name at all? Exodus 3:13 through 14. Then Moses said to God, behold, I am going to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now they may say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Moses asks God, describe yourself, explain yourself, and God says, no, I am. To human understanding, this doesn't make sense, and it is from this word, I am who I am, that Yahweh is derived. And so it causes us to go, yes, that is his name, but it is a name that doesn't actually really describe God at all. For he is one who is stronger than us, and who cannot be named, who cannot be understood, and thus it connects to this theme of God's sovereignty that we have seen throughout the beginning of Ecclesiastes. Chapter 3, talking about time and how God is in control of time. God is above time. And this idea that the created cannot fight the creator. Look at chapter 3, verses 14 through 15. I know that everything God does will remain forever. There is nothing to add to it, and there is nothing to take from it. For God has so worked that men should fear him. God is greater than his creation. He is more powerful than them. And thus this verse 10, serves as a conclusion to this theme of God's sovereignty. But it continues. Verse 11 goes on, "For there are many words which increase futility. What then is the advantage to a man?" The advantage to a man, how powerful is that? That is connecting to a theme that we've seen so many times in Ecclesiastes. This question of advantage. Turn with me to chapter 1, verse 3. What advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun? Chapter 2, verse 22 repeats this, saying, "For what does a man get in all his labor and his striving with which he labors under the sun?" And chapter 3, verse 9 says this again, "What profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils?" And this theme, this question of advantage, what is the point? What is the advantage of man? If life is futile, what is the point? And thus we have our second theme, the vanity of life, and the existential crisis revisited of if life is so vain and so short, then what is the advantage to man? I think it's also important to note out here that he says, "For there are many words which increase futility," which keys me in to remember what he taught before about words. Chapter 5, verse 7 says, "For in many dreams and in many words there is emptiness. Rather fear God." God is sovereign, and life is vain. Our first two themes introduced. But notice in verse 11 that it's not just a conclusion. It's not really just a statement, but it's rather a question. He doesn't answer the question. He only asks it. "For there are many words which increase futility. What then is the advantage to a man?" He asks the question again. And now it can be argued that we've answered that question by saying it is to enjoy the gifts of God, but honestly, the question is still real, and it's still lurking, and I feel that the repetition of this idea, of this existential crisis, that if life is seemingly meaningless, what is the advantage to live at all? And that repeating that shows how important it is, and how you really can't fully answer the question, because even to the most learned man, as what Solomon was, he still ponders his own life, his own mortality, and the purpose for living at all. Verse 12 goes on and brings us to our third theme. "For who knows what is good for a man to do during his lifetime, during the few years of his futile life?" The vanity of life again. "He will spend them like a shadow, for who can tell a man what will be after him under the sun?" And here we have a mix of the vanity of life with the cause of the vanity of life, which is our third theme, the fallen nature of man. What we see here is this idea that death comes to all men. All will die. Life is futile. You can leave nothing behind. We saw this in chapter 3, verses 19 through 20, which said, "For the fate of the sons of men and the fate of beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. Indeed, they all have the same breath, and there is no advantage for man over beast, for all is vanity. All go to the same place. All came from the dust, and all return to dust." All will die. This is the fallen nature of man. And because of death, it causes us to maybe say, hey, maybe we can change the world. But he addresses that as well by saying that life is futile, connecting to this earlier theme. Man cannot change the world. We addressed this when we looked at chapter 1, verses 12, all the way through the end of chapter 2. Turn with me and look at these verses. I mentioned them earlier, but I want to read a couple of them again. It says here, when he talks about wisdom, "I have seen all the works which have been done in the sun. Behold, all is vanity and striving after wind." And we had this word striving after wind being introduced. Chapter 2, verse 11 uses the word vanity and striving after wind again. And then verse 17 mentions it, futility and striving after wind. Verse 23 does not mention it, but only mentions this idea of vanity. So in verse 14 of chapter 1, chapter 2, verse 11, and then chapter 2, verse 17, it uses this word of striving after wind. And striving after wind was a little bit different than vanity, in this idea that If you are striving after wind, you are trying to change the world. You are trying to have control. But the truth is that you're just a shadow, and that the wind will always get away from you because of the vanity of life. You cannot change the world. Death comes to all men, and man does not know anything. We see that as well here. For who can tell a man what will be after him under the sun? A direct reference again to chapter 3, where in verse 11 he says, He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has been doing from the beginning even to the end. And thus, verses 10 through 12 of chapter 6 is an introductory conclusion. A conclusion that is connecting to these three themes of the fallen nature of man, the vanity of life, and God's sovereignty, but also ending it all with questions. Questions pushing us forward into our next section. And the foundation of our next section of living in light of death and how to actually do that, it is founded in wisdom. And this brings us to chapter 7, verses 1 through 12. It looks here like a whole bunch of proverbs and a whole bunch of random sayings, but intertwined through all of this is this word, wisdom. Wisdom shows up first, I believe, in verse 4, the mind of the wise. And then it goes on in verse 5, of a wise man. And it continues on to talk about the things that a wise man does. And in verse 7 it says, makes a wise man mad. And it continues and says in verse 10, for it is not from wisdom that you ask about this. Verse 11, wisdom along with an inheritance is good. Verse 12, for wisdom is protection. And then at the end of verse 12, the wisdom preserves the lives of its possessors. Wisdom is the key word in these verses, and it connects all of these verses. And so, as we ask this question of how to live in light of death, the foundation for the answer is to live wisely. It is to live wisely. So what I want to do today is look at wisdom and Solomon's addressing of wisdom in these particular verses. We have the entire book of Proverbs to really delve into this idea of wisdom. But Ecclesiastes is also a piece of wisdom literature. And as we look at these verses, we can again look at wisdom. But what's very interesting is that as we look at these verses, he's going to talk about the three main themes that we talked about earlier again. And what he's really doing is continuing to drive into your heads everything he said before. Ecclesiastes is very, very repetitive because he wants you to make it very, very clear what he's trying to say. So let's dive into it and try to answer these questions that he is still asking. Verses 1 through 4, a wise view of death. Verses 1 through 4, a wise view of death. This will be our first section. A good name is better than a good ointment. What does this mean? Basically, all it's saying is that reputation is better than an outward display. And that if you smell good or you look good, it's not nearly as important as if you have a good reputation. And the reason for that is connected to this idea of death. That when you die, it's really all your reputation that's going to matter. How you smelled or how you looked is really not that important. And that's why he has that right before he goes into one of the most sobering verses in the book of Ecclesiastes. One of those paradoxes that makes us go, are you some goth kid? What's wrong with you, Solomon? Why do you focus on death so often? And the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. It is a sobering proverb, and it's a proverb that forces us to think. What's very important as we look at this proverb and the proverbs that follow is to understand that he's not saying that the day of birth is bad. Rather, he's saying that the day of one's death is better. They are both good, but one is better. I'll be honest with you that I don't have any really life experiences of how this can be true. I've only been to 3 funerals in my life, and every single one of them were of people I barely knew. And I ignored them and really don't even remember them very much. But the reason I share that is because that's what our society always does. is that when they go to a funeral, they put their earplugs in, is that we ignore death, we hide from it. We hide it away in hospitals. We try to prevent it without focusing on the reality that all will die. The wedding is always longer and better and happier and joyous than the funeral. Of course, this is true, but you can't forget the funeral. I think one of the memories that I do remember from one of the funerals I went to, it was of a relative that I honestly never really had any interaction with. And they had passed, and their funeral was sober and short. And then following the funeral, we had a reception, and the reception was a party. And it makes you go, how can you have a party after a death? And in one sense, it can be this idea of realizing that death does bring joy of going into the afterlife, but that wasn't the point that was going on here. It was this idea of ignorance. This idea of ignoring death, trying to get away from it as fast as possible. But it is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting. Why? Because that is the end of every man, and the living takes it to heart. The reason that a funeral is better than a wedding is because it's educational. And there is so much to be learned when you go to a funeral. Life is put in perspective, and you are reminded of that theme, the fallen nature of man. We live in a fallen world. The angel is standing with a fiery sword next to the tree of life. Eternal life is not possible. You will die. You will die. So stop ignoring it and understand that it is real. And a way that you can be reminded of that is through the funeral. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting. Not that a house of feasting is bad, but a house of mourning is better because it teaches you. Verse 3, sorrow is better than laughter, for when a face is sad, a heart may be happy. How does that make any sense? Well, it makes so much sense because we're in chapter 7. Because we know what it means. We understand that you can be happy in light of death. You are living in light of death. And you are living wisely, understanding that death happens to all, and it should not make you depressed. It should rather realize that life is short and we need to live life to the fullest right now. Not for yourself, obviously, but for the glory of God. Solomon does not speak about eternity. He does not speak about heavenly things here. But I think it's important to note this idea that if you are a Christian, you can be happy because you know that death leads to eternal life with Jesus. It goes on, the mind of the wise is in the house of mourning, while the mind of fools is in the house of pleasure. Once again, this focus on death rather than a focus on temporal pleasures. Understanding that things are going to pass, that people are going to pass away, that life is short. Let us focus on that reality. And by that, we may be able to enjoy life rather than ignoring death. We need to have a wise view of death. And this wise view of death will allow us and enable us to live. And this brings us to our next section, verses 5 through 7, a wise view of life. If verses 1 through 4 showed us a wise view of death and focusing on what is to come and understanding that all will die and focusing on this theme of the fallen nature of man, verses 5 through 7 show us a wise view of life and how to live in light of death. It is our first glimpse, our first instruction of how to live. Not just enjoying life in the way that we've been taught before, but literally, how do I do it? What are some go-to steps on how to live in light of death? And this gives us a wise view of life. It is to live wisely and to understand the second theme, the vanity of life. The vanity of life. It is better to listen to the rebuke of a wise man than for one to listen to the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorn bushes under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. And this too is futility. What is he saying here? Well, first of all, he's giving the instruction that rebuke is a good thing and that we should want rebuke and that the wise give rebuke and that to listen to rebuke is good. But I think there's an underlying theme here, and it's this idea of sanctification. That stop listening to the songs of fools. Stop listening to the people who are saying you're incredible and you're great and you're magnificent and you're awesome and you don't need to change, and be yourself. And rather, listen to rebuke, want to change, want to be sanctified, because life is short and our call in this life is to become more and more like Christ, listening to rebuke rather than listening to the praise of the sinful people of this world. Stop being yourself and start being Christ. Verse 6 is such a funny verse, I think, but in the context of the time, it probably made a lot of sense. This idea of a crackling of thorn bushes under a pot, basically this idea that they make a sort of sound that's kind of like laughter, but it's gone in a moment as thorn bushes burn so quickly, and this noise is just silliness and futility. He's not saying that enjoying life is bad. He's just saying that you can't focus on the enjoyment of life too much because it burns away in a moment. Rather, we need to stop enjoying life to its fullest and enjoy life in the way that God has called us to enjoy life. And that is growing in sanctification, resting in the joy of Christ, and becoming more and more like Him. Verse 7 is a really odd verse here. It says, "For oppression makes a wise man mad, and a bribe corrupts the heart." The way that I read this is that it's connected to verse 5, where it says, "It is better to listen to the rebuke of a wise man, for oppression makes a wise man mad, and a bribe corrupts the heart." And how these connects is this idea that the wise man should be rebuking the oppressors, and that the wise man should be rebuking those who are bribing people. But it's also this underlying idea that wisdom sometimes fails as well, because there still is oppression in this world, and there still is bribery corrupting the world, and there still is evil. However, a wise view of life calls us to understand that yes, there is oppression, and yes, there is bribery, but we're still called to be wise, and we're still called to grow in sanctification, and we're still called to be annoyed at oppression and to not be the oppressor. A wise man understands that oppression is wrong. A wise man fights against that oppression. And I think it's interesting he uses that word oppression, because what does it connect to but chapter 4 and the themes that are there? And so thus, in verses 5 through 7, we have an introductory lesson on a wise view of life. And a wise view of life is understanding that life is vain, understanding that death is always knocking at the door, and living in sanctification, living rightly, living for Christ, living to become more like Him, living wisely, growing, and being able to listen to rebuke, not oppressing others, not taking bribes, but rather being an upstanding man or woman for God, even in the hardest times, knowing that at any moment you may die and stand in the face of a holy God, and that you want to stand rightly, because at any moment there will be death, and that every time you go to a funeral, don't joke off or run the other way, but rather listen, learn, remember, understand that life is short, understand that we live in a fallen world, understand that you are fallen, and that you need to stop being yourself and start being Christ. This is a wise view of life. A wise view of life. And now we have a wise view of control. And I think this section that we're going to go into is very interesting, and I was trying to come up with a title to really summarize what 8 through 12 talks about. And I listened to a sermon from Austin Duncan that also split up this passage into these 3 sections, not these titles, as he went through a different theme that is here. But it's a lot of passage in 8 through 12, and there's a lot going on there. And I was trying to connect it to what we looked at before of this idea of death and life, and I think control is the right word. And let me explain, is that you have no control over your death. We know that, and we've talked about that in Ecclesiastes before. You have no control over your own life. We've talked about that, and we've looked at that before. And so, in light of death and in light of life, we need to have a wise view of control, understanding that we have no control. And thus, it's a great juxtaposition that what came before of, yes, grow in sanctification, yes, become more like Christ, but understand that really you have no control because God is sovereign. And thus, verses 1 through 4 connect to our first theme of the fallen nature of man, verses 5 through 7 connect to our second theme, the vanity of life, and 8 through 12 connect to the theme of God's sovereignty. God is in control, and this should lead us to act wisely. Let's enter this text. The end of a matter is better than its beginning. Patience of spirit is better than haughtiness of spirit. What does this mean? Well, he's giving a really practical realization that if you're on any endeavor, an earthly endeavor, the end of a matter is better than the beginning because you see what's happened and you can learn from that. And really, this idea of if it failed, you can learn from it, or if it went really well, then you have the successes of that. But I think it's more to that. It's this idea of when you're at the end of a matter, you know, and you have knowledge of what happened before, and you fully understand it. But I think it goes even deeper than that, that there is this heavenly idea that for a Christian, the end of a matter is eternity with Christ. And that is so much better than the beginning, which is the life we are in right now. And to understand the end of the matter, while we are in the beginning, should lead us to have patience, spirit, better than a haughtiness of spirit. Patient hope for what is to come, rather than pride in ourselves and in our own time and in our own control, understanding that God is in control and we are not. This then leads directly into verse 9 and 10. 9 says, "Do not be eager in your heart to be angry, for anger resides in the bosom of fools." And what this is saying, it's not anger towards other people, it's anger towards the one who is stronger than you are. It's angry at the one who has caused these trials to be in your life, the one who has caused you to stumble, the one who has denied you from that college or said you cannot go that direction, the one who has shut that door in your face because he saw that that was the just and the right decision and the holy plan that is far above our own. Do not be angry at that. And I love how he uses the word eager because it connects to this idea of patience, that we have to live patiently. Patient hope, understanding that God is in control. He's in control of life. He's in control of death. We are not. Do not be angry at him. Why? Because it is foolish. And it says this again in verse 10. Do not say, "Why is it the former days were better than these?" For it is not from wisdom that you ask about this. Don't listen to the past. Focus on the present and living for God now. Maybe you're in a hard time now, but it doesn't matter because Christ is still good. God is still good. And I think it's interesting that he mentions this idea of the past because it's a reference to chapter 3. That which has been already and that which will be has already been. But here, for God seeks what has passed away. He knows what has happened in the past. He is in control of that. He allowed that to happen, and he allows what's happening now to happen as well, and he's in control of the future as well. God is in control. Do not be angry at him for that, for it is not wise, because you have no control. And then verses 11 and 12 are very interesting because they talk about this idea of wealth. It is wealth revisited, something that we talked about in chapter 5 and chapter 6. And when he talks about wealth here, is he compares it to wisdom. He says here, wisdom along with an inheritance is good. This is not saying wisdom is as good as an inheritance or wealth you inherit. He's not saying that inheritance is better than wisdom. Rather, he's saying that wisdom and money is good. And that they are both, notice this word, an advantage to those who see the sun. How interesting is that? And notice that in that sentence about advantage, there's no question mark at the end. Wisdom and money is an advantage. We have an answer. Wisdom is the answer to this problem. What is their advantage to a man under the sun? It is wisdom. And money makes it even easier. And he does mention money as a good thing here. For wisdom is protection, just as money is protection. But the advantage, notice that word again, of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of its possessors. Wisdom is great, money is great, but wisdom is better because wisdom lasts and it does not go away fleetingly. It does not run out. The wisdom of God continues forever, and also from a heavenly perspective, we know that wisdom, godly wisdom, preserves the lives of its possessors all the way into eternity. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be. And if your treasure is the wealth of this world, then your heart is there. But if your heart is in wisdom, godly wisdom, fearing God, living for God, and obeying Him, it will lead you to eternity with Him. And wisdom will allow you to persevere. But he does note here that money is not a bad thing. Rather, money actually allows you to act out on your wisdom and allows you to do good things with your wisdom. It makes me think of the parable in the New Testament about the king who gave money to his servants, and the one who gave 5 doubled it to 10, and the one who gave 10 doubled it as well. And really, that says that the one he gave more was able to do more wisely with it, and the one who gave less, he was able to do less wisely with it. But what's also interesting is the one who gave the least, he gave that person did nothing with it. And so it's this idea of that wisdom is good and that wealth is good and that teamed together they are perfect. But if there is too much focus on wealth, then it is wrong. But what is money? It is this attempt to have control. And so what he's saying here is you have to measure your control, which is enabled by wealth, with wisdom and living wisely, understanding that you have no control and that that wealth can be gone in a moment and that God gave you that wealth. And so thus, verses 1 through 12 give us a wise view of death, which should lead us to have a wise view of life, growing in sanctification, knowing that at the end is death and standing in front of God. And this should also lead us to a wise view of control, understanding that we have no control, and that God gives these gifts, and God takes away, and God is in control, and He's in control of the good times and the hard times, and through it all, He is in control, and you are not. And through this, we look at the fallen nature of man, the vanity of life, and God's sovereignty. And wisdom thus serves as a foundation of how to live in light of death. In your Bible, verses 13 through 14 may be in the same poetic area, or they might be written similarly in like the font or the way it's organized in your Bible as the verses before. But I listened to a sermon from Austin Duncan, and the way it's written, I would agree with what he says, that verses 13 and 14 are not part of this poem. Because as you read them, you'll notice that they're separate and they're different, and they really do connect to chapter 6, verses 10 through 12. Let me read them to you. Consider the work of God, for who is able to straighten what he has bent? Well, this sounds very similar to what he was saying earlier about how you cannot box with God. You cannot fight against God because he is stronger than you are. It's also interesting that whoever is able to straighten what he has bent, this is quoting or mentioning again what he said in chapter 1, where it says, what is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. That's in verse 15 of chapter 1. And so thus, here again, he talks about God's sovereignty and control, and how he's greater than we are. For who is able to straighten what he's bent? And then he goes on, in the day of prosperity be happy, but in the day of adversity consider, God has made the one as well as the other. This idea that man is named, the animals are named, God has named all of them. God is greater than man, so that man will not discover anything will be after him. Connecting to the fallen nature of man and the vanity of life, as it said earlier in verse 12, for who can tell a man what will be after him under the sun? But notice this in verses 13 through 14. The question marks are removed. Yes, there's a question mark in verse 13, for who is able to straighten what he has bent, but that's a rhetorical question, because we all know the answer. So really there are no question marks. 13 through 14 is a reflection of chapter 6, verses 10 through 12, but in a different way, because they're statements and they're truth. And the question is removed because we now have the answer, and the answer is to live wisely. And he's saying here that in the hard times, in the good times, be happy. Understand that God is in control. God gave you your name. God is the one who will decide when you die. And God is the one who we should be living for when we live. Because life is vain, God is sovereign, and we live in a fallen world. All of these are true, so let us live wisely. This verses 13 through 14 are a sort of bookend to this introductory section. And they're a very interesting bookend because the question marks are removed. We don't need to ask what is the advantage, because the advantage is to live wisely for God and for Him. And so in conclusion, we are called to live in light of death by living wisely. I want to connect real quick to a couple of verses in the New Testament before we close up that I think continue this idea. The first of them is Philippians 1:21. And I bet you've heard all of these verses before, and they're fantastic verses, great memory verses as well, but I just want to read them again. Philippians 1:21 says this, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." This idea of living wisely, understanding that death is to come, and death is with Christ, and to live is with Christ. Understand that death, what follows, is eternity with Him. It is this eternal mindset, this heavenly mindset. Look with me to Hebrews, which repeats this idea. Hebrews 12:1-2. "Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, the heroes of the faith who have come before, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." Basically, have a heavenly focus. Understand that God is in control, that life is vain, and that we are fallen humans. So let us throw away the sins of the flesh and become more like Christ, growing in sanctification as we live on this earth. Let us live wisely. And then the last one I want to turn to is 1 Corinthians 9:24-27, which says, "Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but only one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may win. Everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath, the vanity of life. But we an imperishable, that heavenly mindset. Therefore I run in such a way as not without aim, I box in such a way as not beating the air, but I discipline my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified." Live in light of death by living wisely, growing in sanctification, understanding that God is in control, understanding that death is always knocking at the door, and understand that when you die, it is Christ who is at the other side if you are a Christian. And when you stand before God, you want to be one who has fought the good fight, who has lived rightly, who has done what is right, and who has lived wisely, living in light of death. Thank you, and I'll see you next week.